There were many things that I didn't get to talk about in my recent debate with Paul Copan. One of those things that I wanted to talk about was Numbers 31 and the issues that that raises for the topic of rape. So we're going to talk about that here. So let's begin by taking a look at the passage. Here's Numbers 31. God brings vengeance upon the Midianites. So Luke can begin by reading here in verse 15 to 7 to 18. Have you allowed all the women to live? Moses asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord of the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now, kill all the boys, kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. And then we read down below from verse 32 here. The plunder, after they had wiped everybody out, the plunder remaining from the spoils that the soldiers took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 women who had never slept with a man. Okay, so let's talk about this passage. First of all, let's just back up here to verse 17 and 18. So again, Moses directs the Israelites to kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. I want to focus for a moment on this word translated as girl. There's actually two Hebrew words here. Isha is can mean woman, or it can also simply mean female. And in this context, it clearly means female because then there's a qualifier afterwards. Taf is child. So Isha Taf is translated as female child or girl. And so what the passage here is specifically saying is save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. And then if we turn again back down to here, we read 32,000 women were taken as plunder or spoils by the Israelite army. The word there is simply Isha. Now, again, you can translate Isha as woman. So in the Genesis creation narrative, for example, man is Ish and woman is Isha, and she comes out of the side of man. But it can also mean females. In other words, not specifically adult women. And here, it clearly, this is a bad translation to translate it as women, because we've already have in the earlier passage, verse 18, a reference to Isha Taf, or a young girl, or every young child, female child, or young girl. So I think the Living Bible has a more accurate translation of verse 35 when the Living Bible translates it as young girls. So in other words, they had taken 32,000 young girls for the soldiers. Now, let me admit at the outset what someone like Copan is going to say is that the numbers are, we have good reason to believe the numbers are highly inflated. And for whatever reasons you want to get into about that, that's fine. So let's say it wasn't 32,000 women. Let's say it was 320 women. What we actually have there is then maybe 320 young girls being taken as plunder or spoils for the Israelite army, and everybody else having been killed. So some of the things that we should think about this passage. Well, the first thing, maybe the thing that I've already just talked about, is saying, well, the numbers are inflated. We shouldn't actually believe it was 32,000. It was much fewer. That's not really relevant when we're talking about the moral evaluation of the text. Let's talk about another issue, rape, rape itself. You know, if you say 32,000 people were raped, well, that's horrible. It's unconscionable. But if you say it wasn't 32,000, it was only 320 people who were raped, It's still a moral atrocity. Even one rape is inexcusable. The fact that you've got more than one only compounds the offense, but it doesn't minimize the offense. And likewise here, whether it was 32,000 young girls and untold hundreds of thousands of others, men and women and boys that were butchered, or whether it's a much smaller number, maybe a few hundred or 1,000 men and women and boys that were slaughtered, and only 320 young girls, right? They're still dealing with something that is morally unconscionable and heinous and terrible. Now, Copan says in his book, which still, as of the production of this video, is forthcoming. It'll be coming out October 18th, I believe, 2022. Is God a Vindictive Bully? Copan says in that book, well, but why the boys? Like, why would God command, or why would Moses here command the killing of the boys? And then he gives an explanation. He says this would prohibit their rising up in the next generation to attempt Israel's overthrow. So what we have there, I think, is an appeal to a general ethical principle. The principle is one of preemptive child slaughter. And the idea is that if you anticipate that a child who has faced trauma from an external army, if that child is at a higher risk of retributively acting against their oppressors once that child grows up, then you're justified in butchering that child. What an extraordinary claim that is. Again, I'm going to just read his words one more time. Copan in the book says, why the boys? Why kill the boys? And he gives the answer. This would prohibit their rising up in the next generation to attempt Israel's overthrow. Let's go back to 2003 and think about this. Imagine, American troops have invaded Iraq in 2003. Now, one of the things that was pointed out in the wake of the invasion of Iraq is that this was a great way to foment resistance against and hatred of Americans and make it more likely that young boys who had been oppressed by the Americans who had invaded their country of Iraq made it more likely that they would go on when they got older to join ISIS or Al Qaeda or some other insurgent group that is actively opposing the West. Now imagine if, based upon that reasoning, one invoked this principle that Copan seems to invoke here, which is that you are ethically justified in killing boys or children if you believe it is more likely that they will in the future grow up and oppress you. And I find that to be just an extraordinary claim, and to my mind, a totally indefensible one. So I'm not persuaded that the killing of boys, based upon the possibility that in the future they will otherwise revolt against you, I don't think that that's justified. I don't think that you're justified in slaughtering children, young boys, or women, or civilian men. I don't think you're justified in slaughtering them based upon the anticipation that there's a higher likelihood that they will actively oppose you in the future. Now let's talk again about those young girls of verse 18, the Isha Taf, the young girl. How old would these young virgins have been? Well, standard age, if you read about ancient Near Eastern societies, it's pretty typical that children at that time, young girls, would have been married off just at the cusp of the onset of puberty, and usually about 12 to 14 years old. So they would not be virgins for very long after being 12 to 14 because they'd be married off and they'd be engaging in sexual relations. So not only do we have the preemptive cautionary slaughter of boys in order to prevent the possibility that they might oppose the Israelites in the future, but Copan then says, well, he doesn't say anything explicitly about this, but we have 12 to 14-year-old girls. That's who the virgins would be. All the women have been killed. They've been slaughtered. And so the Israelite soldiers would have 32,000 young girls, virgins, or 320, right? Whatever it is, we've got terrified young girls here. Now, Copan says on page 164, he also gives this defense that he says, according to Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14, female prisoners of war were given dignity because the female prisoner of war could, quote, wait a month to marry the Israelite soldier. Or sorry, that's not a quote. That's my paraphrase of what Copan says. So she had the opportunity, the freedom to decide to wait 1 month from before she had to marry the Israelite soldier. And during that month, she could grieve the loss of her family. And so this is taken by Copan to uh, demonstrate some sort of high-minded nobility on the side of the Israelite soldiers at this point. But think about what we're actually saying here. So what we have is in the Midianites, you have like 12 to 14-year-old little girls uh, who have just watched their families butchered. Their dad was hacked into pieces with a sword. Their mom perhaps was impaled with a spear and repeatedly impaled as her entrails spilled out into the dusty ground. Her two 8-year-old and 6-year-old brothers were maybe bludgeoned to death with bricks. And all of this happened at the hand of Israelite soldiers while this 13-year-old weeping, screaming girl is watching on. And after all that, this girl is told, but here's the good news. You can grieve the loss of your family, of the dad that was hacked apart, the mother that was impaled, and your 6 and 8-year-old brothers that were bludgeoned to death with bricks. You're given a whole month to grieve them before you have to marry one of the Israelite soldiers that just cut apart your dad and impaled your mom and bludgeoned your brothers to death. Think about the extraordinary nature of that. That's what's going on here. Copan says it's a good thing that these young girls would be given a month to grieve the loss of their families, the slaughter of their families. I, on the other hand, do not find that to be a particularly significant mitigating factor. And then I now want to come finally to the issue of rape. Should we talk about rape in this passage? Now, commentators, Copan certainly among them, have noted there's no mention here of rape whatsoever. Fair enough. But I think we also have to have an honest conversation about what sexual consent looks like. And I'm not convinced that Paul Copan has a very uh, adequate understanding of what sexual consent looks like. One reason I believe that is because on a couple different pages, on page 90 and 165, he refers to Bathsheba committing adultery, quote, committing adultery, unquote, with David, King David. And of course, this is not just Paul Copan. This is a very common way of phrasing that story of David and Bathsheba, that she committed adultery with David. But in fact, it's not adultery at all. Susan Scholes has pointed out in her 2010 book that given the power differential between David and Bathsheba, here you have a common subject and the king, whose word is law, whose demands you cannot refuse. He commands her to come into his chamber in order to have intercourse with her. She doesn't have an opportunity to say no. As Scholes says, quote, since her consent does not matter, his action equals rape. Other commentators have noted this as well. For example, David Lamb describes what David does to Bathsheba as a, quote, power rape. And I think that's exactly right. Bathsheba doesn't have an opportunity. She's not a willing participant here. And there's this really nefarious way of phrasing the story or framing the story that I remember hearing back to when I grew up, that Bathsheba was something of a temptress on bathing in a place where she could get within eye shot of the king and so seduce him. I mean, that's just not in the text. And I think that's just a deplorable and misogynistic way of framing the text. The reality is that David raped Bathsheba. She could not give sexual consent. And she's an adult woman. Now think about a 12 or 13-year-old little girl who just watched her dad hacked into pieces with a sword, watched her mom impaled with a spear, watched her 6 and 8-year-old brothers bludgeoned to death with bricks. And she's told, you now have the opportunity to marry one of the soldiers who killed your family in 1 month. Is there really any sense in which she can willfully consent as a 12-year-old girl to marrying this adult man who slaughtered her family, butchered her family in front of her? I don't think so. So while there's no mention here explicitly of rape, whether it's 32,000 little girls or 320 little girls or 32 little girls or 3 little girls, what you have here is terrified, traumatized little girls suffering the deepest depths of post-traumatic stress disorder, agony, deep depression, fear, anguish, and are now told that you have to marry one of the men who slaughtered your family. There's no room for consent within that framework. And to conclude this video, I want to note the final irony. Paul Copan on page 136 of his God, a Vindictive Bully actually invokes Boko Haram. Boko Haram is the word haram or harem is in Arabic a similar meaning to as in Hebrew, is to be something set apart or forbidden or consigned to destruction. And Boko refers to Western education. So Boko Haram was a movement. It is a Muslim movement in Africa that is actively opposing Western culture. And one thing they do as a Muslim group, they're a radical Muslim group, is they invade Nigerian villages and they kill the family, the adults, the parents, and they steal the young virgin girls for the soldiers. And this is what Copan says on page 136. How should we react when Nigerian Christian girls are kidnapped, raped, and enslaved by the terrorist group Boko Haram? Not to mention this group's displacing entire communities, slaughtering as these terrorizers roam the Christianized countryside. So Paul Copan here is indignant. He's outraged at the evils of Boko Haram, and I agree with him 100% on that. What I simply want to say is that's exactly the kind of behavior that you're rationalizing in your reading of Numbers 31. What you have in Numbers 31 is clearly the soldiers slaughter all the men and the women and the little boys. And then they keep all the virgin girls for themselves. Now, I'm not sure what happened to the 3, 4, 5, 7, 8-year-old girls, but certainly the marriageable age girls who just watched their family butchered, they are now given the quote opportunity to marry an Israelite soldier after 1 month, presumably, of grieving the horrendous, horrific, terrifying loss of their family. That is a multiple war crime. That not only is a genocidal action against the Midianite people, it's a mass atrocities of mass murder, but it's also setting up the conditions for rape. And so if you're going to condemn the actions of Boko Haram, which I definitely think you should also be willing to be morally consistent, likewise to condemn the actions of the Israelite army as it is narrated in Numbers 31.